Good morning, everybody. I hope everyone's doing well, staying warm. Congressman Pittenger, I want to say, first of all, thank you for inviting me to be part of this distinguished panel, and thank you for your years of work pulling together parliamentarians from around the world to discuss critical issues. I think it's fair to say this forum has always been a venue where emerging risks, common challenges, and common approaches to dealing with those challenges have been front and center, and I want to commend you and the team that have always put this together. I've been fortunate to be a part of these discussions in the past, and so I'm very pleased to be back with my colleagues Dan, Lilita, and John. Let me set the table a bit on the issues of illicit finance to give both a little bit of historical context, but thematic context for the discussion we're going to have today. Illicit finance has in many ways become a predominant theme and not just a discipline in the international community. And there's been a very stark evolution over the last 20 to 30 years as to how nations around the world and how different sectors have thought about illicit finance. Illicit finance, of course, is the domain of financial crime and sanctions and corruption that we often think about, that deals and lurks in the shadows and relies on opacity, the opacity of financial flows, commercial relations, and business dealings. It often relies on impunity, the inability of authorities and actors and governmental regulators to actually impose costs or risks on those engaged in illicit activity. And of course, bad actors, be they rogue criminal organizations, terrorist groups, or even rogue nations, rely on the fuel of profits to drive their ambitions and to drive their operations. And so what we've seen over time is a recognition that illicit finance is not just the realm of law enforcement trying to make a case or arrest a bad actor, but it's fundamental to how we think about our security and the integrity of our systems. Much of the domain of illicit finance was defined in the 1980s, 1990s, the FATF standards and the expectations around the world, largely driven by concerns around drug money laundering and the financial crime that goes along with tax evasion. And with that, a sense that not just government authorities, but the private sector banks had a responsibility to ensure that illicit finance wasn't flowing through their systems, that they weren't facilitating that activity. And that then developed the entire regime of compliance and the requirements of banks to file suspicious activity reports, the development of financial intelligence units to analyze that information, and the attempts at least to build cases and follow the money where illicit activity was happening. Well, that evolved quickly in the post-9/11 period, where the realm of illicit finance was seen very much as a fundamental part of national security, where now terrorist financing and proliferation finance and broader systemic risks to the financial system were considered. And what then evolved with the private sector was a sense that we needed to think not just about following the money or building cases, but about preventing financial crime and illicit activity from happening to begin with. How can you be preventative and predictive and actually stop the bad actors from getting access to capital in the financial system? So much of what you've seen in that post-9/11 period is exactly that. How do we grow a more effective international system to prevent bad actors from getting access to the system? That led to the FATF fourth round and fifth round of mutual evaluations. Many of your jurisdictions have seen or experienced this, where the question of not just do you have laws on the books, do you have an FIU in place, but do you have an effective regime that allows you to prevent these activities from happening to begin with? Does that exist? And so we moved into that period. Now we're in a very different period, a period where we've seen the amplification of the national economic security issues at play with respect to illicit finance. And so now this is no longer just a question of where are the bad actors engaging in and trying to access capital, but a broader question of how countries are demanding and establishing the integrity of their systems systematically. How is corruption and kleptocracy taking hold, and how are we affecting it? And frankly, how are state actors involved in illicit activity? And what this has meant is a convergence of risks, actors, and regimes. And I'll do this very briefly and quickly. In terms of risks, there's now a blending of the illicit activity that leads to illicit proceeds. Human trafficking, arms trafficking, drug trafficking. A sense that these are not just security issues, but challenges to the integrity of governance and the rule of law. Second, a convergence of actors, where you have organized criminal groups, drug cartels, even militia groups and terrorist groups, all beginning to blend and articulate common interests through commercial and financial relationships, control of territories, even economies and sectors that are powerful. And of course, states that are enabling this, depending on lurking in the shadows. The Russians' use of the shadow fleets to evade international sanctions. The North Koreans' use of crypto and cyber capabilities to access billions of dollars that they wouldn't otherwise be able to access. The use of Chinese money launderers to move money in the fentanyl trade and otherwise, that in some ways has gone unchecked by the Chinese government. And so a blending of actors that make it harder and harder to deal with these threats. And then a blending and convergence of regimes. And by this I mean what we've seen over time is not just laws with respect to anti-money laundering or tax evasion or even corruption, but a blending then with the sanctions regime. Sanctions on terrorist actors, drug actors, cartels, and even state actors that are enabling this activity. We've seen this most recently in the United States with a focus on crypto activity, where sanctions are being applied on various crypto actors and exchanges that are trying to obfuscate or hide the origin or the beneficiary of financial activity. And all of this, of course, is enabled by new technology, which is making it a bit harder and more challenging to track these activities. New forms of digital identity that are taking hold, new payment rails that are emerging, some of which my colleague Dan Swift has written about in the Wall Street Journal in terms of Chinese payment systems embedding in places like Myanmar. Crypto technologies and exchanges, and especially here in the United States with the passage of the Genius Act by this very august body here in Congress, with the establishment and the legitimation of stablecoins. With the New York Times writing just yesterday about the increasing risks of the use of stablecoins by illicit actors, because with stablecoins, of course, you have a cryptocurrency that's pegged usually to the dollar that then has stability and value, which then illicit actors can use for exchange and off-ramps and commercial activity. And so the concern that I've always had now for over a decade with crypto, despite its huge advantages, which I readily admit, is the concern that illicit actors gain access to capital and payment rails and commercial activities and networks that they would otherwise not get through traditional financial means, because we've built up the controls and systems and reporting and enforcement in those traditional sectors. Last but not least, the realm of illicit finance is now fundamentally a part of economic security. In the United States now, it's become trite to say economic security is national security. And you've seen that fundamentally in the policies of the Trump administration and how Congress is thinking about the use of economic tools and statecraft. Well, it's illicit finance that forms the core of those issues. It's part of the competition and conflict that's happening between nation states. It's part of the question of corruption and kleptocracy that goes to issues of good governance and democracy. It goes to questions of economic access and financial inclusion. And it goes fundamentally, as my colleague Dan again wrote about, to the question of what the future of the financial system even looks like, and what are the forms of integrity that are built into these new payment systems and rails. So what is then to be done? What we've done together collectively, and Congressman Pittenger, this is why your fora is so important. We need to cooperate and collaborate. We need to have effective prevention of illicit finance. We need to build law enforcement, intelligence, and regulatory capabilities together to share information and insights. We need to use new technology to actually track and trace, which is happening, to claw back illicit resources. I've often talked about leveraging the private sector to do more in terms of pulling illicit activity back. We have a new company that uses federated artificial intelligence to share insights, which means to move models of behaviors, to discover risk without ever having to move or share data or aggregate the data, which becomes very important in a cross-border context or between government agencies or even between the private sector and the public sector. We have to work very hard on systemic issues, in particular kleptocracy, and where illicit finance has gained hold over governance and rule of law. We have to root that out together. And finally, we have to be aggressive in targeting the efforts to exclude the illicit actors from the system, to target where they're congregating, and to isolate that behavior so that we can leverage the benefits of the movement of capital, new technology, crypto, stablecoins, while isolating those activities. So there's a lot to be done together. This is a continuous evolution, but what's fascinating about the field of illicit finance is that it's now core to these issues of integrity, security, and economic statecraft. So with that, thank you. I commend to you a wonderful couple of days of this conference. Congressman Pittenger, thank you very much.